Immovable object. North Korea's 7 years at war with American power. America's comfort women in Korea. The myth of consent. A picture is worth 1,000 words. While the horrors of the Japanese Empire's comfort women system imposed on the Korean peninsula population is well known, the much larger system subsequently set up by the U.S. military that operated for decades in South Korea is scarcely spoken of. Excerpt from Immovable Object, North Korea's 7 years at war with American power by A.B. Abrahams, published in December 2020 and available on Amazon. A number of means were used to coerce women into entering the comfort women system and providing sexual services to American personnel. One very significant, though indirect, means of coercion was the destitution, which had resulted from the policies of both the U.S. military and Reagan government. The wartime scorched earth policy destroying entire towns and villages across Korea and burning the crops and livelihoods which people had relied on for generations, left a large segment of the population with few possessions and no means of providing for themselves. At a conservative estimate, the war created 2 million refugees in South Korea, and between 20 and 25% of the population at the end of the war could not support themselves. Little was done to compensate these families or help them restart their livelihoods. This, combined with Reid's economic inaptitude, his focus on militarization of the low wages available to conscripts, and the poor social welfare available meant many Korean families faced very serious destitution. Thus, both during the war and afterwards, when a presence of hundreds of thousands of Americans remained, many women, particularly mothers with dependents, had no choice but to enter the comfort women system. The claim that the comfort women system was based on consent thus strongly contradicts the available evidence from both South Korean and U.S. sources. Professor Arisa O concluded in her own study, many women had few options other than questionable employment in tea rooms, restaurants, and bars where a thin line separated the hostess and the sex worker. A thin line separated the hostess and the sex worker. Other women were seduced through false promises or raped. Widows often resorted to sex work to support their children. It was often the reality that women had to either sell their bodies to Western soldiers or see their children starve. In 1952, the final year of the Korean War, the U.S. State Department reported that of the UN antis, a term for the prostitutes servicing the Western soldiers, half were widows. This statistic alone is highly indicative as to the true nature of prostitution in wartime and post-war South Korea, and the desperation of those who entered the trade. Professor Lee Jin-kyung, an expert on labor migration in South Korea, noted regarding the nature of the consent of South Korean women to serve American soldiers that it was hardly worthy of the term. Regarding the nature of the consent of South Korean women to serve American soldiers, that it was hardly worthy of the term. It was in fact very similar to the system of comfort women Japan operated, but on a far greater scale. She concluded regarding the nature of prostitution in South Korea, prostitution is an occupation choice that is largely forced on them as a matter of bare subsistence and survival. Prostitution as a matter of bare subsistence and survival. Prostitution is an institutionalization of sexual violence via commercialization for the ways in which the consent is forcibly manufactured out of unequal social and economic relations among sex workers, their employers, and their clients. In other words, considering this inherent coerciveness and structural violence built into prostitution, I would like to conceptualize prostitution as another kind of necropolitical labor. Necropolitical labor is a term she coined for forced labor in which there are significant risks of violence and death, evidenced by the number of prostitutes killed or otherwise seriously harmed in their work by GIs, but the alternative to which is death. But the alternative to injury, harm is death. Page 318 to 320, Chapter 11, The U.S. Military in South Korea. Full references provided in the book. Immovable object, North Korea 7 years at war with American power.